Chapter 5 of J.S. Bach. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. J.S. Bach by Albert Schweitzer. Translated by Ernest Newman. The Chorale Prelude before Bach. In proportion as the independent performance of the verses of the songs and hymns on the organ fell into disuse through the logic of events, preludizing on the chorale became of importance. How this preludizing was carried out until the time of Scheidt we do not know, since no compositions of this kind have been preserved. None even of Scheidt's have come down to us. But from his time to that of Bach, the most notable masters of the organ dedicate their powers not to free composition, but to the chorale prelude, or, as they said in those days, to preambling to the chorales. The three great masters in this field are Pachelbel, Bohm, and Buxtehude. We cannot indeed say that in technique they created anything new beyond Scheidt. In this respect, indeed, organ music has on the whole not gone beyond the Halle master even to the present day, nor can we imagine how it is ever to be done. Scheidt was one of those men whose penetrating intelligence, when a new world opens out before them, darts through it at once from end to end, with the clearness and swiftness of light. In his polyphonic chorale verses for the organ, he saw himself faced by the problem of making the melody stand out clearly in performance, with a special tone color, not only in the soprano, but also in the alto, tenor, and bass. And at a glance he surveyed all possible solutions and embodied his knowledge in those famous pieces which, generally speaking, contain everything that we can imagine in the way of employing the manuals and pedals in conformity with their special qualities. In the third decade of the 17th century he speaks of the playing of two obbligato parts on the pedal as quite a matter of course, and thinks that every organ should have a 4-feet pedal stop, so that the organist may be able under any circumstances to play a middle part with the feet. The path was now traced out for most organ players, and, what in the first place was almost more important, for the organ builders. They had only to go forward. Middle German and North German organ music outdistanced that of the Romans and the Southern Germans almost at a bound. Spitta rightly says that what was regarded in the South as a test of the highest virtuosity looks almost like an elementary exercise in comparison with the compositions of the Northern organists. Thus, as regards technique, there were no new conquests for Pachelbel, Bohm, or Buxtehude, and their epoch to strive after. It was reserved for them, however, to create the various forms of the chorale prelude. Pachelbel's conception of it is almost the grandest. He conceives the chorale prelude as a chorale fugue. Each separate phrase of the melody is worked out in the fughetta-like prelude, at the conclusion of which it appears as a cantus firmus. The chorale prelude as a whole thus consists simply of separate fugues which are held together by the fact that their themes taken in succession form the melody of the chorale. It is the form of the chorale prelude as we have it, for example, in the two great arrangements by Bach of Aus tiefer Not, 6, numbers 13 and 14. This style was very largely cultivated at that time. Pachelbel exercised an influence upon Central Germany that cannot easily be overestimated. He was not a genius, he was not even always clever, and his art is not free from a certain stiffness and formality. He had, however, a real sense of the dignity of the organ, and communicated it to his pupils. That was his greatest service. We must remember that in Scheidt, as in Frescobaldi, a secular conception of organ music as an art exists side by side with the religious conception of it. Even the Tablatura Nova bears traces of this dualism. for it impartially gives variations upon secular songs and upon chorales. With Pachelbel, this impartiality disappears forever from German organ music. If the average level of German organ playing in Bach's time was higher than any that has been attained since, it was entirely owing to Pachelbel. As a type of that generation of organists, we may mention Johann Gottfried Walther, Bach's colleague at Weimar, whom Mattheson, the Hamburg author, called Pachelbel II. He composed, as Mattheson tells us in his Critica Musica, 1725, a complete year of chorale preludes of the Pachelbel type. Two of them, by an error of transmission, were included among Bach's work. This is a testimony to the art of them. They are indeed written in a correct organ style that at times shows considerable richness of invention. The chorale preludes of Johann Christoph Bach (1642 to 1703), organist at Eisenach, and Johann Michael Bach (1648 to 1694), organist at Geren, the uncles of Johann Sebastian, also give us an idea of the thorough capabilities of the organists of Pachelbel's generation. With all its excellencies, however, the Pachelbel form of the chorale prelude labors under the grave artistic defect of incoherence. The chorale melody, the bond that should hold together the separate fugettas, cannot really give them intrinsic unity. In the last resort, they amount to no more than a string of fragments. The chorale prelude of the Pachelbel type is indeed really conceived on choral lines. When the words are added to the melody, the two together weld together the separate fugal movements into an effective whole. In the chorale choruses in Bach's cantatas that are constructed on the model of Pachelbel's chorale preludes, in the cantata Ein fester Burg, for example, the impression of homogeneity is very strong. In Pachelbel's chorale preludes, where the melody is deprived of the words, this is not the case. Each fugetta has an independent existence. This was perceived by the composers of the time, who consequently felt themselves justified in elevating the fugettas upon the first lines of the chorale to the status of the independent compositions. It may be taken as certain that a number of the surviving chorale fugettas of Pachelbel upon the first lines of the chorale originally belonged to complete chorale preludes, and were first separated from the whole by the copyist for reasons of a practical nature. Bohm, the Lüneburg master, has an entirely different conception of the chorale prelude. He is under the influence of the coloristic style of the school of Sweelinck. His favorite method is to break the chorale melody up into luxuriant coloratura, and to keep this rich and flowing paraphrase moving about over a simple harmonic accompaniment of a more or less free nature. He has nothing of Pachelbel's formal dignity. His works are all life and movement. He makes use of the basso ostinato, that is, the continual repetition of a characteristic motive in the pedal, a means with which Bach, in his chorale preludes, afterwards attained such striking effects. Bach's arrangement of Nun kommt der Heiden Heiland will give some idea of the style of Bohm. Only parenthetic mention can be made of the Hamburg organist Johann Adam Reinken, who has attained a certain fame in the history of the chorale prelude by means of two works of appalling length. Heinrich Scheidemann, a pupil of Sweelinck, organist at St. Catherine's Church in Hamburg, had been his teacher. Reinken succeeded to the latter's post in 1664, and occupied it 58 years until his death in 1722. He was very proud of his two lengthy chorales. The first, on Es ist gewillig an der Zeit, contains 232 bars. The other, on An Wasserflüssen Babylons, ran to 335. He had the latter engraved on copper. The melody, as in Bohm, moves about in colorature of all kinds, while the accompaniment, which is more in Pachelbel's style, is constructed out of the motives of the separate lines of the melody. He uses the double pedal a good deal. Great as is the technique and the virtuosic ability shewn in these two works, from the musical point of view, they are unsatisfactory. Everything is calculated merely for outward effect. The melody is tormented to death, and the hearer feasts on the dexterity of the torture. Incomparably higher stands the Lübeck organist Dietrich Buxtehude (1637 1707), who in 1668 succeeded the famous Franz Tunder at St. Mary's Church. He is the greatest organist between Scheidt and Bach, and may indeed be regarded as the real creator of the German organ toccata. His chorale preludes are chorale fantasias of the most varied kind, from the simplest to the most ingenious. In the simple ones, the melody goes its way quietly, just embellished here and there with a few ornaments, and accompanied by interesting and always ingenious harmonies. Bach's chorale preludes upon Herzlich tut mein Verlangen, 5 No. 27, and Liebster Jesu wir sind hier, 5 No. 36, are written in the style of these simple fantasias of Buxtehude, and give a good idea of his work, except that the copy rather idealizes the original, since the fervor with which Bach fills these little fantasias is not as a rule found in those of Buxtehude in anything like the same degree. In the large chorale preludes, Buxtehude tears the melody in pieces, throws the fragments into the flood of a brilliant animated fantasia, and sends them scudding along, one in the soprano, another in the alto, another in the tenor, another in the bass, according as his fancy suggests. Bach's chorale prelude on Eine feste Burg, 6 No. 22, is wholly conceived in the spirit of this virtuosic style, using the term in its good sense of Buxtehude. Such are the forms of the chorale prelude created by the masters of the end of the 17th century. From the formal standpoint, they performed their task to the full, since they worked out rigorously all the possible types of the species. There are three of these. In the first, the whole prelude is constructed out of the motives of the melody, in which case the latter is not altered in any way, but runs through the whole as a cantus firmus. This is the motivistic method of Pachelbel. In the second, the melody is broken up into arabesques that climb and wind like a flowering creeper about a simple harmonic stem. This is the coloristic method of Bohm. In the third, the melody forms the core of a free fantasia, as in the chorale fantasias of Buxtehude. All other imaginable kinds of chorale prelude are only intermediate forms between these three main types. We may, for example, in a Pachelbel chorale fugue, lightly color and ornament the cantus firmus, or weave motives of the melody into the harmonies that support the chorale arabesque of the Bohm style, or lastly, derive the themes of the Buxtehude fantasia more or less freely from the melody of the chorale. Bach found these main types and the intermediate forms already in existence. He created no new ones. Even Brahms and Reger, modern as they are, have not done so, for it is quite impossible. The only difference between Bach and his predecessors is that he did what they could not, made something more than form of them. The more we try to see into the development of things, in any field whatever, the more we become conscious that to each epoch there are set certain limits of knowledge, before which it has to come to a halt, and always at the very moment when it was apparently bound to advance to a higher and definitive knowledge that seemed just within its grasp. The real history of progress in physics, philosophy, and religion, and more especially in psychology, is the history of incomprehensible cessations, of conceptions that were unattainable by a given epoch, in spite of all that happened to lead it up to them, of the thoughts it did not think, not because it could not, but because there was some mysterious command upon it not to. In the same way, the true history of art is the history of invisible, insuperable barriers, which only fall when the due time comes, without any one understanding why this happens exactly when it does, and not just as well earlier or later. Thus it is incomprehensible that the masters who created the types of the chorale prelude did not recognize that they were no more than forms, and felt no necessity to give life to the form by breathing into it the poetic spirit that was associated with the melody. They could not see that the chorale prelude, really to answer to its title, must be born not only out of the melody but out of the text. As the pre-Bachian masters of the chorale movement harmonized only the melody, not the text, the inspiration of their chorale preludes is a purely musical one, owing nothing to poetry. No matter how ingenious their ideas may be, they never flow from the text. In Buxtehude everything is interesting. Many chorale preludes are full of real feeling. In one or two of them, indeed, the text is to some extent reflected in the music. In the prelude upon Durch Adam Fall ist ganz verderbt, for example, where he more than once suggests the fall by figures in the bass. On closer investigation, however, we discover that these reminiscences of the text are more or less accidental, and that he was as little concerned as the others deliberately to take the poetry as his starting point. Thus all they did was really only pioneer work. Perhaps we should not know that it was only such, if the greater spirit had not come after them, who, almost before he had ceased to be their apprentice, comprehended with the intuition of genius that the true chorale prelude must bring out the poetry that gives the melody its name, and prepare the hearer not only for the melody but also for the contents, a spirit, too, who had the secret of making tones speak. In no other art does the perfect consign the imperfect to oblivion so thoroughly as it does in music. Early painting retains its own artistic charm for all time. It deals with nature, with reality, and renders it, no matter how awkwardly, with a primitive truth that makes so direct an appeal to the spectator of all the epochs that he himself looks at the scene with the childlike eyes of those early artists. Music, however, does not depict the external universe, but is the image of an invisible world, which can only be expressed in eternal tones by those who see it in its whole perfection, and can reproduce it as they have seen it. Anything less than this pales and fades in the course of time, even to unrecognizability. It may indeed be of historical interest as a record of an aspiration towards a goal, but it has lost the power of giving direct artistic satisfaction. This is the experience of every one who has been affected by the chorale preludes of Buxtehude and the other old masters. At first he is amazed at the artistic treasures he has discovered. When, however, he goes further into them, a more sober mood comes over him. He realizes that he has been looking at them comparatively, that is, with a historical understanding, and has appraised them with that acquired idealizing justice which is indeed appropriate to the investigator, but must be wholly foreign to the artist, the criterion of art being absolute and immediate. Thus the chorale preludes of the composers before Bach are finally, for the modern admirer who wishes to do them justice, and even more than justice, no more than what they are in themselves, forms that they created for the greater master who has to come after them, so that he might find them when he needed them, and make living things of them. End of chapter 5. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama.